Pastor Dana, thank you for being with us today on Public Process.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. And let me just, for those of you who don't know, because we're not on video at this moment, Dana is about as pregnant can get. And so she gets extra props for actually being here today, because, I mean, she's literally on the verge of being popping any minute.
Any day now.
Any day now. And so I really appreciate that she's willing to take some time to be with us to talk about some really, really important stuff. So, Pastor Dana, we had you on, oh God, I don't know, it's been a couple of months ago maybe?
Yeah.
Just to talk in general. And there was this emerging issue, schism within the Methodist Church regarding inclusion and welcoming of LBGT people. Can you talk about where that is and what's happening now? Because I know there are developments, and I know that there are real different approaches to how this is being dealt with in the Methodist Church.
So when we last talked, I think I had said that they had voted on the traditional plan, which is punitive towards LGBTQI persons, particularly clergy. But we were waiting for the jurisdictional council to vote on the constitutionality of it. I know that's getting very jargony. But it turns out that, so the jurisdictional council voted on it, and they voted that the majority of it was constitutional. They did vote down a few things, which was really nice to see. But it certainly brought a lot of heartbreak, and it was not what a lot of people were hoping for. And so our bishop for our particular conference, we are in the Northern California, Northern Nevada conference, has been going around touring all of her, not all of her churches, but like each of the big areas, and kind of spoke to what that means for us, because we do have kind of like federal versus state. We do have a little bit of independence in the church in our particular conference. And one of the big things that she said is, you know, us here on the West Coast, at least our conference, we have been practicing inclusion of LGBTQI people for the last decade at least, and we will continue to do so. Now is a time to resist, which I found really refreshing. So I know that that's the approach that we are taking. It's turned into a little bit of a vicious back and forth in a lot of other areas, and perhaps even in our own conference. And it's been hard, but it's good, at least for me. I agree with the bishop. I believe that now is a time to consciously resist so that we can perhaps hopefully make change in the church, because, you know, if I'm getting biblical, Jesus calls us to love, not just tolerate.
Let's talk, if we can, about, so you were talking about it getting kind of vicious. And one of the things I realized that we both sort of used some acronyms, if you will. I started it off by saying LBGT, which for my understanding is lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans. You added Q and I. I think I know what Q is, but explain what that is, please.
Yeah, it's probably good that we clarify this. So yeah, LGBT is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. The Q, there's a lot of letters. It gets longer and longer.
Yeah.
But the Q stands for both queer and questioning, depending on which person you're talking to and how they identify, right? And the I is usually, it's also got a few different meanings. It can be intersex, it can be inquiring. I think those are the only two.
It depends on who you're talking to. And as you said, I mean, the list sort of grows, and I guess that's a good thing, but and at the same time, it's kind of like, wait a minute, what are we actually talking about here?
Right. Yeah. And I think it's really important to address why we keep making this list of letters longer and longer. And in my opinion, it's important to acknowledge those people and how they identify, however it is they identify. And I'm including myself in that list of letters, right? And because there's been so much ignoring of those identities happening in the general society, right? Like, unless you are straight, heteronormative, you don't really exist. And so by acknowledging all of those letters, we're actually saying, like, hey, we acknowledge that you identify as something other than cisgender, heteronormative, straight.
It's interesting because as I usually do, I spend a good portion of my morning, reading the news and listening to the news. I'm a bit of a news junkie, and I was reading a story about some pro wrestler who is in an interracial marriage, right? Mm-hmm. And he said something to the effect of, "I don't see color." And his wife said, well, then you don't understand my experience.
Yes.
So, rather than this, let's not see any of that or acknowledge any of that, and saying that somehow or another means that we are accepting and all of that, it doesn't really, because if you're not doing that, you're not really fully understanding that person's experience or making an effort to understand it.
Yeah, you're not acknowledging the differences that exist between us. And each of us have very unique differences to ourselves. And as humans, we just want to be seen for who we are, no matter who that is.
And for me, and here now, I'm perhaps speaking a bit, like the preacher. I mean, if you can't be seen for who you are in the eyes of God, then who can you be seen for who you are in the eyes of, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So we're talking with Pastor Dana, Methodist pastor here in Crescent City. You're tuned to KFUG, Crescent City, 101.1 on your FM radio dial, worldwide on the internet, kfugradio.org. This is Public Process. I'm Mike Thornton. I have these things sometimes where I glitch a little bit because I do two shows here, and then I was interviewing one of our local city councilmen, and I said, and Grass Valley City Council member Alex Fallman, right? Because I used to do a program on another radio station. So every so often I have to go, wait a minute, okay, where are we? What are we doing? Who are we talking to? And what are we talking about? So, Pastor Dana, we're talking about this group of people that we have discussed who they are, who some of them are, and that the church, part of the church, is resisting including them as part of the congregation, and in some ways more importantly, not more importantly, but more pointedly, particularly as clergy.
Yes.
And this is being done based on some sort of constitutional premise. I don't know how that works.
No, not a constitutional premise.
Well, I mean an internal constitutional premise within the church.
It's more of actually a biblical literalism that is kind of fueling this, right? And it's fueling on both sides. Those who are for the traditional plan are focusing on what the Bible says about homosexuality and all of that, and what has traditionally been said about homosexuality, regardless of whether or not it's in the Bible. And then those on the opposite end of the spectrum are saying, how can you be arguing for this point if you're saying that the Bible says homosexuality is a sin in that one scripture? Why are we not also punishing clergy who are divorced and remarrying? Anyone who is a woman and preaching, because that's also in the Bible as something that should not be done,
or,
right?
Or anyone who wears two different kinds of cloth, right?
Right. If you wear clothing that is like interwoven with a synthetic fiber, so it's that broad spectrum of argument that is really, people are starting to get cruel.
Well, and let me ask this, because at least my understanding, and I am not a theologian, but my understanding is that whatever comments are made about homosexuality in the Bible are exclusively in the Old Testament. Is that correct?
Nope.
No, there is in the New Testament as well.
Yes.
Okay.
So the one that most people point to is from Paul, where he focuses on. I'm a bad pastor. I don't know the exact scripture of it, but it's from one of Paul's letters, and he says that homosexuality is a sin. But he also references that we should be celibate, right? But the majority of the scripture around homosexuality is in like the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And then there's context to it that you have to look at. Like, why are they saying what they're saying? And it was because they were fighting against the Roman emperors having young male sex slaves, right? Or you had to procreate. There's all sorts of reasons for why it says what it says.
Right. And I guess maybe more pointedly, and once again, guys, I'll be corrected maybe, Paul may have said this. Jesus didn't say any of that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's in Paul's letters, not in the Gospels.
Right. And the last thing, I won't say it well, but nobody who professes to be a Christian does it because they believe that Paul is the Son of God, right?
Right. Although our branch of Christianity that has delineated tends to follow Paul's teachings a little bit more than Jesus's teachings, which baffles me.
Because there's a bigger schism, and that was the schism of the Romanized Christian church that Paul really helped create, versus the James, brother of Jesus church that remained in Jerusalem and largely remained to be Jewish, correct?
Right, yes.
We're speaking with Pastor Dana Gillport of the Crescent City Methodist Church. You are tuned to KFUG Crescent City. This is Public Process. I'm Mike Thornton. So, Pastor Dana, you were saying that things were getting kind of vicious. Talk about what you mean when you say that.
It's heartbreaking to see, for me at least, a church that I love, and people that I love, because I've lived and participated in church communities on the East Coast, in the South, in Texas, and over here on the West Coast. And, on Facebook, social media, Twitter, everyone is at each other's throats. Like, you better defriend me if you hold this stance, or, just yelling at each other. And it's heartbreaking to me. I don't know how else to say it. And I recognize that some people need to have their boundaries and be like, you know what? I can't be interacting with you. This is too painful of a process. I get it. And for me, I feel called to be in connection, even when it's painful. Sort of thing, to try and mitigate and hopefully make change, because I believe that change happens through relationship.
I guess for me, and I get it, people have what they believe, and they believe what they believe, and I guess, and I find this often, and I think it's something we're going to branch into in a little bit, is that people profess to be Christians. And what I know of the message of Jesus is love, 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 don't judge, don't hurt other people, love some more, treat the poor with dignity and respect,
which is a form of love.
And love, more love, turn the other cheek, all of that kind of stuff. And then so much of that in our society, and others as well, manifests itself in yelling at people, discriminating against people, damning people to hell, whatever it is.
The antithesis of love.
How does that happen?
That's something that I address in my sermons on a regular basis. I joke with my congregation, and it's a running joke among clergy that pastors only have one sermon, right? And my one sermon is love. Because that, for me, is the gospel. It's Jesus's ministry, shows up in different ways, but that was Jesus's ministry. And I have no idea how we got that way. My nephew, who is 2.5 years old, gets grasps the concept of love more than some adults in my life.
Yeah, I know. It's really kind of mind-boggling how. And I guess what I'm trying. No, please, you go ahead. Please, you go.
Well, I was just going to say, and I think that it's, it comes from fear and scarcity. And there are a lot of things in our society, like the lack of love comes from fear and scarcity, right? We end up operating from that negative perspective instead of the positive perspective, because we have, politicians shoving it down our throat. We have media shoving it down our throat. We have a bigger world view, so we're seeing more violence in the world, and that makes us even more scared, right? Like, there's a lot of things at play, and a lot of it is broken human nature.
Yeah, you said it better than I was going to say it. Thank you very much. We're talking with Methodist pastor Dana Gillport. This is Public Process on KFUG 1127 on this Memorial Day. So your bishop, the regional bishop, how big a region is this? You talked about northern Nevada and California into Oregon, maybe?
No.
Okay.
It stops at California and Nevada borders. But I believe, give or take a little bit of mileage, our conference cuts off at the elbow of Nevada. So that's what we consider northern Nevada. Right. And it goes all the way to the border of Idaho. Is that what borders Nevada? I'm so bad with state geography.
Oregon, part of it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But then for Northern California, part of it, it's like Bakersfield and San Luis Obispo is kind of the cutoff, and the rest, which is funny to me because San Luis Obispo is Southern California. But so we have a big conference. That's a lot of churches.
Do you have a guesstimate how many churches it is?
No, I mean, I could throw a dart in the dark for you if you want.
Please, and realizing that it's a dart in the dark.
God, I'd say at least 800 churches.
Okay.
I'm really bad at guessing numbers. Don't ever ask me to count marbles in a jar.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, and it's a ballpark figure, and we realize, that you were very clear that you didn't. So that's fine. And while some religious leaders may be supposedly infallible, we will give you the opportunity to be slightly fallible.
Oh, thank you.
So your bishop, the regional bishop, has said resist. What does resist mean?
I asked her that very same question. And it's going to show up in a lot of different ways for different people. Some of the examples that she gave were to practice being more overt in our congregations about our acceptance of LGBTQI people, right? Because the church, the big church, right? Not necessarily our church in this community, but the big church, the greater church, has been so abusive and hurtful to so many LGBTQI people because we have said that homosexuality is a sin. And all that goes with it. There's a lot of baggage that goes with that statement. So I think that it's really good that she's encouraging us to be more overt and say, you know what? We thought it was implied, but now we are going to go so far as put a rainbow flag out in front and say all are welcome here, regardless of who you are. Or She said, put up a banner or become what's called a reconciling congregation, so there's a reconciling ministries network, and that is the exactly what I was just describing. It's a way to formally and officially state, hey, we love all people. We are a fully inclusive church, regardless of your background, regardless of your identity, who you are.
Does that include an acknowledgement of past wrong in it as well? The reason I'm asking this is because I'm not Christian, as you know, but I love kind of like, midnight Catholic mass.
Yeah.
I think it's just cool,
Yeah.
And so I go periodically, and I've also gone to some other, and realizing that Methodist and Catholic are different things, I know that much, but I have on occasion seen particularly Catholic priests start their mass by making an apology, particularly for the sexual abuse and lack of addressing it that has happened in the Catholic Church. So is reconciling, and I don't mean that there's been a sexual abuse scandal in the Methodist Church, but is it akin to that at all, of making amends for past wrong?
I think it could. It doesn't necessarily, but I think it is. I personally think it's an important part of moving on past the pain. You can't move on past something that has been so traumatic to some people in your community without making appropriate reparations, right? And so for me, if say our church was to decide to become a reconciling congregation formally, I would probably try to in some way make reparations on behalf of the United Methodist Church in this community, like specifically for this community. I can't speak for the Greater Methodist Church.
Sure.
Because we don't know the ways in which we are hurting people on the margins sometimes. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we're very aware of it, right? But a lot of times it's ignorance. So even if we think that we are scot-free because we're a loving congregation and we have a few LGBTQI people in our congregation, that automatically means like we don't need to make reparations. We love everyone. Well, no, not necessarily.
We're speaking with Methodist pastor Dana Gillport. This is Public Process on KFUG. I'm Mike Thornton. Thank you for being with us today. So, Pastor Dana, so here's a question. It might be a little bit pointed, but so how does being a welcoming church, how does that play out in our Crescent City and Del Norte community? And the reason why, and I want to be really clear, I'm saying this.
Yeah.
You're not saying this. I'm saying this. I think that a number of the churches and pastors in this community probably would not be on board with being a welcoming, reconciling congregation.
Right.
How does that play out in the broader Crescent City Del Norte religious community? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yeah. It could go one of two ways, I think. It could make us as a community, a religious community, a social pariah. To be honest, I don't have the pulse of, or the beat to the fullest extent that I could of the community's general attitude towards LGBTQI people. Mm-hmm. I can only speak from my personal experience, right? But I think that it also has the potential to have us stand out, and maybe even like have people be like, oh, I do have a home in a community that is a faith-based community, because I think a lot of people are looking for it. Not everyone is looking for that, but a lot of people are. And so my hope is that it's the former, right? I think, right? Did I say that right? The one that makes us stand out in a positive way.
And let me say, that Dana is doing a yo person's job of doing this interview and being really pregnant. And
I have real bad pregnancy brain,
and pretty uncomfortable, I would imagine as well. So let's give you some props for that. So Dana, I guess. So one of the things that's really on my mind is that I think you're right that a lot of what drives people to be involved in things is seeking a sense of being part of, of being, of belonging. And I think that gets manifested in positive and negative ways. I mean, I know I was listening to some guy who's like a former neo-Nazi who now like works with people to try to help them get out of that. And that he was saying that really for many people, the reason they get involved in that is less because they actually believe in being a Nazi and more because it's a place that will accept them and that they can feel that they belong to, that they have a community.
Yeah, everyone wants to feel like they belong.
And it sounds like a lot of what's happening with this, particularly around LGBTQI and the Methodist Church, as far as the resistance is concerned, is saying, yes, you do have a home.
Yeah.
If you want that home can be with us.
Yes, absolutely. And that, at least for me, is my hope for our community at Crescent City United Methodist Church.
And it seems to me that should be the role that religion plays. I mean, that's my opinion, is that it should be a place that people can go for comfort and acceptance and belonging, and to, I want to say this the way I really mean it, have people and a set of principles that they can organize with and organize around in order to have a more fulfilling life, both in the temporal world and related to their spiritual condition, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're speaking with Pastor Dana Gillport. This is KFUG's Public Process. So Dana, I'm going to ask this really super broad question.
Okay, shoot.
Shoot, okay. Religion is used to justify and promote a lot of social and public policy throughout our entire country. As someone who is clergy in a church, I'm assuming that you think of these things and you look at it from your perspective. I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And I realize it's a gigantic topic, but I'd really like to get your thoughts on that, because clearly it's happening in big and small ways all the time.
Yeah. You know, it's a delicate, might not be the right word, but we'll go with it for now. A delicate process, because you know, Jesus was so political. Religion is political. Like, if you think about it, politics literally means for the people. It is something that, you know, our local government does, but it's for the people. Religion is also for the people, so it is inherently very political. And then people are like, but there's separation of church and state. Well, yeah, that means that the state cannot tell the church what to believe or tell us what to believe. But that doesn't mean that our faith can't inform our politics, right? And I'm a big advocate of that. My faith definitely informs my politics. And I did not get political or activist centered until I found my faith. But that is a growing thing in our country, in our social climate at the moment. And it's a two-headed beast. It has a really positive aspect to it, or it can, and also a really negative aspect. Like, and all of it, it's all perspective, right? Like if you're on the conservative end of things, your faith informs your politics and you think that that's awesome and perfect. Like, for example, the abortion issue, because it's a hot topic right now, right? It's very fueled by the conservative religious movement. And then there is the other end of the spectrum that is perhaps not as religious, but also very religious. There's just more people who don't identify as faith-based in their ideas.
Well, so here's what I'm hearing, right?
Okay.
And you correct me, okay? So religion, by its very nature, is political.
Yeah.
And we have a particular model in Christianity of that, the life and actions and words of Jesus, right? Okay. Then we get into how each person interprets their faith and then uses that faith to inform and or direct public policy. So are we in a space and condition where we will always have these differing interpretations of the same religious text, fighting it out for supremacy in our laws and policies and ordinances and all of that? I mean, right?
It's a tale as old as time. Like if you look at like Constantine in the empire, the Roman Empire, he said, okay, Christianity is the main religion. And he used it and interpreted the scriptures to enforce what he wanted to enforce. It's been being done since Jesus's time.
So that leads me to this. I think and I'm using shorthand labels, realizing that they're shorthand labels and they may even be stereotypes, and I understand that. It seems to me that the conservative right-wing religious community has understood this for quite some time and has been vocal and vehement in shaping or trying to shape, influencing public policy based upon their interpretation of religion, whereas the so-called liberal left has been absent from that fight. Right?
Yes. And, if you look at the history, and I'll use abortion again. I know it's a hot topic issue, but I'm just using it as an example.
That's fine.
The conservative right evangelicals used to be pro-abortion, at least in terms of rape, incest, health of the mother. And then something happened in I think it was the mid 70s, right after Roe v. Wade was passed. And they were like, well, what issue should we focus on? There's money in abortion. Let's start being anti-abortion. The Southern Baptist, it might not be the Southern Baptist Convention. It might have just been the Baptist Convention. So I'm hoping I'm not misspeaking, but they just before Roe v. Wade had voted that it was a positive thing to allow for abortions and decided to start advocating for abortions. So, things change over time, and it just depends on where the center of power lies.
Well, and I guess in my mind, there's a difference between people who have a genuine religious belief saying, I have a genuine religious belief, and because of that genuine religious belief, I think X. Mm-hmm. Whereas as compared to somebody saying, I think X, how can I manipulate or justify this through attributing it to a genuine religious belief and using that as an excuse to push a particular policy agenda forward. But I'd still like to get back to this thing, and and I'm not asking you to speak for all liberal lefty church people, okay? But it does seem like, because I know that those folks exist, and I also know that they have been, for the most part, either reticent or ineffective at taking back some of the religious discussion. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's this stigma around talking about politics if you're religious, especially I think in the left-wing community, right? Like, no, you don't want to ruffle too many feathers, right? You don't. This was actually in my sermon yesterday. You don't want to make your church numbers go down because church is already declining by addressing politics. So a lot of the liberal-minded people will stay quiet. Whereas the conservative side of things is not having that issue. It's gaining momentum, right? But I think that those voices are definitely out there and they're starting to grow, at least in my social circle.
Well, and I guess that, and once again, I mean, I come at this more from a political organizer and activist, and I think that if churches were more vocal politically and socially and in the community, that they would actually be more attractive.
I agree.
To people, and particularly I think for those folks who are, sort of constantly being, damned to hell, by one group of people. It's like, well, you know what? They may think that, but we're here, and we're not just here for you in a passive way. We actively have your back, and we will actively stick up for you in the community, in the broad spectrum of ways that an organized church could do it. Yeah.
Well, there's a growing movement in newer churches, what we call church plants, of having churches without walls, because the idea is that we are here for the community, not just to sit around and worship on Sunday mornings. That's not to say that worship on Sunday mornings is not so important to our spiritual well-being, right? But it's the acknowledging that God is in other places and God is calling us to other places. And I find that really refreshing. I love the idea of having a wall-less church that goes out into the community and does activism, although there's, laws around how much lobbying you can do. Right,
based on tax-exempt status and those kinds of things.
But, they're being activists, they're lobbying, they're getting out into the community and clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, helping the sick, housing the homeless. Most of those tend to be in larger urban areas that I know of.
Well, and let me ask this, because I think that happens in a lot of communities to bigger or lesser degrees. And what I'm talking about is the service aspect of it. Let's get some groceries and give it to some poor people. Let's go out and give them some clothes or some sleeping bags. And to me, that's different than let's go out and change public the system policy that creates these people in need of bags of groceries and sleeping bags.
Yeah. It's, I think that is starting to become an awareness, like in seminary. I actually took, my senior seminar was, faith and public policy, where we got to go to Board of Supervisors meetings, city council meetings, and learn how to get involved in the local community, and then also going to the Capitol and lobbying and talking with senators, right? That's a new thing that is happening in seminaries that's training our clergy. And I think that it needs to be happening more and more, because otherwise we're just going to constantly be catching up, trying to address the need rather than changing the policies that are making that need exist.
We're speaking with Pastor Dana Gillport of the United Methodist Church here in Crescent City. This is Public Process. I'm Mike Thornton. Thank you for being with us today. So Dana, we've got a few minutes left, and so we've been talking about a couple really big categories of things, is that, internal church dynamics and how churches are struggling, some churches are struggling internally between value systems and interpretation of Scripture that are polar opposite and really, I don't think can be reconciled. Yeah. I think the same is true with abortion. I mean, if you believe it's murder, you believe it's murder.
Right.
If you believe that it's, not that, then, those are things that can't be reconciled. Right. And then we're talking about political action based on religious belief and how people can have very different interpretations of that, even based on the same text. Mm-hmm. How do we, as a community, an interactive community, because I don't think that we should just have our religious leaders tell us what to do, and I don't think our religious leaders should just say, well, we'll do whatever they want. How do we work on this,
Oh, that's an easy question. No. It's going to be different for everyone, and a lot of us need to take baby steps, right? Because that can be scary territory. It puts you at risk for becoming a social pariah, especially in a small town like this. You get known very quickly as, the rabble rouser or the wave maker, right? It happens, and but the more people who get involved, the less stigma, I think, will be attached to those particular people, because they'll be like, more than just two people care about this issue.
And Jesus was the rabble rouser.
He was. He flipped tables.
That was his gig. I mean, his job was, going in and flipping tables and straightening out the Pharisees and all of that stuff, right?
He called the Pharisees broods of vipers because they were sticking to tradition over what was good for the actual community. Right? They were like, no, we can't feed that person because it's the Sabbath. And Jesus was like, what do you mean we can't feed that person because it's the Sabbath? This person is hungry and dying. Right? He broke the rules. He made waves. He flipped tables. Right.
Yeah. Or let's stone Mary Magdalene to death because she's a prostitute. No, you can't do that. Right. And up until the point where, and it's a good question, because in the 2 minutes we have left, I know we can't answer it. But I mean, the intersection of, why was Jesus crucified, right? I mean, I don't mean the part of whether he had to be crucified.
Not the theological reason,
but the intersection of this guy's a pain in the ass to the Jewish priesthood. And or this guy is proclaiming to be the Messiah, which is the prophesied revolutionary leader who will overthrow the Roman protectorate, and how all of that comes together, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He was a political threat. And so the people in power were like, let's get rid of this guy. He's too much of a threat.
Well, and he was a threat to the Romans in that, because Messiah, a lot of people claim to be the Messiah.
Yeah.
And that was a revolutionary leader who would take up arms against Rome.
Well, it was going to be the new king of Jerusalem. Right. The Messiah was the king. And so they're like, wait, this is our kingdom. You can't be the king.
And then he was the revolutionary leader who was taking the rich and powerful Jewish aristocracy and priesthood to task as well by saying, no, you don't get to run things.
Yeah.
And you don't get to treat these people bad because they're poor and they're outcast and all of that.
Right.
Well, this is me talking again, but I'm going to say we need a lot more of that in our churches. We need a lot more Jesus the revolutionary, Jesus the rebel, Jesus the overturner of tables.
Yeah.
And maybe less the, let's be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jesus wasn't always nice.
He wasn't always nice. Yay for Jesus on that account. We've been speaking with Pastor Dana Gillport of the United Methodist Church here in Crescent City. Pastor Dana, any final thoughts you have for our audience and
Oh, Lord.
on this day?
No, I don't know.
She's just struggling getting through this whole thing.
Deep breaths.
I know, yeah. Because I'm just telling you, she's as pregnant can get. So, Dana, thanks a lot for coming in. And I always enjoy having you here. I hope I'll have you back. By that time, you'll be a new mother and all of that.
Yeah, maybe you'll hear some baby cries on the radio next time.
That sounds good to me. I'm all about baby cries. Thank you for being with us. Really appreciate it. All right, you are tuned to community-supported radio, KFUG, Crescent City. This is Public Process. I'm Mike Thornton. Stay tuned because we are scheduled to be joined by President of the Crescent City Harbor Commission, Jim Ramsey, in just a few minutes. And looking forward to that as well on this Memorial Day on your community radio station, KFUG, Crescent City.